Hi there. Welcome back to Haunting Vales. Today we're going to talk about The Final Toast, a Hercule Poirot mystery wrapped in secrets, betrayal, and a toast that marked more than celebration. In this chilling tale, nothing is what it seems, and every clue leads deeper into a garden of lies. So, stay with us as we unravel this intricate puzzle piece by piece and follow the greatest detective of them all into a mystery that begins with a single broken glass. Chapter 1. The Dead Man's Glass. The rain had begun long before sunset, sweeping across the rolling hills of Oxfordshire with a steady chill that soaked the trees and cast the sky in heavy gray. But inside Charnwood Hall, warmth glowed. From polished sconces, the scent of aged port and lemon polish hung in the air, and the fires crackled in ornate hearths beneath paintings of long-dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to watch over every guest. It was the 70th birthday of Lord Reginald Amersham, and though he had long since retired from public life, his name still echoed in powerful circles, from the House of Lords to the boardrooms of old money dynasties. The guest list for the evening was short, curated with surgical care: 20 names, no more, relatives, business confidants, 2 old flames, and a single journalist known for discretion. And yet, even with the wealth of manners and conversation that filled the drawing room, there was something Poirot had noticed upon arrival that gave him pause, not in what was said, but in what was unsaid. The smile seemed slightly fixed, the laughter carefully measured, and Reginald himself, always known for his booming voice and sharp charm, looked tired, worn beneath the celebratory facade, as though this party was not a joyful gathering, but a final act in a quiet tragedy long in the making. Poirot, of course, had not come for celebration. His invitation had been written in Lord Amersham's own hand, its contents unusually brief. Monsieur Poirot, your discretion and clarity of thought are needed. Attend my birthday. There is something that must be witnessed. That was all. No details, no explanation. And so Poirot came, traveling in from London by private car, arriving just as the mist began curling between the hedgerows that lined the long drive to the manor. Inside, Reginald Amersham stood like a statue cast in bronze, tall and stern despite the years, dressed in a deep navy suit and white cravat, his once dark hair now silver, slicked back with a precision that revealed the deep lines around his mouth and temples. He greeted Poirot personally in the front hall with a brief handshake and a subtle nod, but there was a shadow in his eyes, an anticipation that flickered, then was gone. Monsieur Poirot, he said, voice low and firm, thank you for coming. I trust you'll keep your mind sharp this evening. Then, without elaboration, he drifted into the drawing room where the other guests had begun to gather near the large fireplace. The room was elegant, of course. Every inch of Charnwood Hall was. But Poirot noticed more than furnishings. He saw the way James Amersham, the nephew, lingered near the drinks tray with clenched jaw and eyes that followed his uncle like a tethered hawk. He noticed Lady Felicia Greystone, a woman of poise and history, dressed in pearl gray, watching the room with a gaze so sharp it could slice bone. She had once been engaged to Reginald, or so society whispered, though their affair had never made the pages. And then there was Mr. Ellis Rowe, the solicitor, his spectacles low on his nose and his smile practiced, sipping a brandy while chatting with a guest Poirot did not yet know, the young woman named Madeleine Vexley, introduced only as a close family friend, though no one seemed entirely sure how close or how familial. The conversations rose and fell like waves on a shore, gentle but never too deep. Everyone was polite. Everyone was measured. Poirot said little but observed everything. He observed how Madeleine touched the chain around her neck every time Reginald looked her way. He noted the tension in James' shoulders each time business was mentioned. He saw how the staff, particularly the head butler, Reeves, cast glances at the old man with something like pity. At 8:15, the dinner gong rang, and the guests filed into the dining room, their footsteps muffled by Persian rugs and the sound of rain pelting the long windows that lined the corridor. The dining room was a grand chamber with a sweeping vaulted ceiling and a single long table dressed in ivory linen and gold-rimmed plates, each place setting immaculately arranged with monogrammed napkins, polished silver, and tall, narrow flutes. Already filled with golden champagne, Poirot was seated midway down the left side, between Lady Felicia and James. Across from him sat Mr. Rowe, and further down, Madeline. Reginald took the head of the table, standing behind his chair as the final guest entered and sat. With a subtle tap of his spoon against his glass, he raised his voice, not loudly, but clearly. To friends, he began, to legacy and to truth, and to what must finally come to light. It was a toast, simple and elegant. But beneath the words lay something else, a promise, or a warning. Then his Saturday dinner began. A first course of white asparagus with truffle vinaigrette was followed by partridge in red wine reduction and roasted potatoes. The wine was vintage, the conversation shallow, but Poirot's mind never ceased its movement. Lady Felicia leaned in during the second course. "You know," she whispered, "he's changed. Reginald. He wasn't always this, contemplative." Poirot nodded. "You speak as one who knew him deeply." She smiled thinly. "Once. But that was another life. These days, he plays chess with secrets instead of pawns." Across the table, James sat silent, his eyes fixed on his plate, barely touching his food. He flinched when Reginald spoke his name across the room. "My nephew," Reginald said with a slight smile, "has recently taken an interest in the estate's accounts. Perhaps too late." A few nervous laughs followed, but James did not respond. Poirot leaned slightly toward him. "You are quiet, monsieur." James shrugged. "I didn't ask to be here." "Then why did you come?" James looked at Poirot with tired eyes. "Because he told me I had to. And when he says that, you listen." Mr. Rowe chimed in from across. Reginald always did have a flair for the dramatic. But tonight, even I'm not sure what game he's playing. By the time dessert was served, pear tart with clotted cream, the tension had crystallized. Everyone could feel it. Reginald stood again. The room stilled. He held his glass delicately. "I thank you all," he said, "for your presence tonight. I had planned to make a longer speech, to share something significant. But I find I no longer have the time for speeches, only for truth." He raised his glass. "To what must come." Everyone followed. Glasses clinked gently. Reginald took a sip. A second passed, then another, and then, without a word, he collapsed. It was immediate. No cry, no warning, just the sound of a body falling and glass shattering. His chair tilted backward. The stem of his glass snapped on the edge of the table. Champagne splashed across the white cloth like a spreading stain. Silence froze the room. Then chaos. Lady Felicia screamed. Mr. Rowe stood so fast his chair toppled. James remained frozen, his expression unreadable. Madeline gasped and covered her mouth. The butler rushed in from the hall, face pale. One of the guests, a retired physician, hurried to Reginald's side. He knelt, checked the pulse, opened the collar. But within seconds, he looked up and shook his head. "He's gone." Poirot did not move. His eyes swept the table. 20 guests, 19 full glasses, one broken. He rose and spoke calmly. "No one is to leave this house. This was not natural. This was not chance. This was murder." The physician nodded. "Poison. Instantaneous. Likely cyanide. It must have been in the glass." The staff confirmed the glasses had been placed ahead of time. No one had touched them after seating. "Except," Poirot added, "for the murderer." He turned to the butler. "Reeves, did you leave the dining room at any point while the table was being set?" The butler swallowed. "Just briefly, sir, to fetch a bottle of wine from the cellar. I was gone less than a minute." "A minute," Poirot said softly, "is all it takes." The guests were escorted back to the drawing room while the staff prepared for the arrival of the local inspector. Poirot remained behind. He circled the table, studying each place setting, noting the untouched glasses, the symmetry of arrangement, the way one chair, James's, still bore the marks of an uneasy guest. He asked for the list of wine bottles, the inventory of glasses, the seating chart, and then he asked for something else, the envelope, the one Reginald was said to have prepared, the one marked for reading during the toast. But it was gone. Nowhere in his study, not on his person, not in the dining room. Then we know, Poirot said at last, that Lord Amersham was murdered not in anger, but in desperation. He was about to reveal something, something someone could not afford, to let see the light of day. And so they killed him, quickly, silently, in front of us all. Rain pounded harder outside as lightning flashed across the windows, briefly illuminating the room with a pale light. Poirot turned slowly to face the drawing room, where 19 suspects sat in strained silence. Somewhere among them sat the killer, and Hercule Poirot, with order and precision, would find them. Chapter 2. The Envelope of Silence. The morning after the tragedy at Charnwood Hall dawned with an oppressive stillness, as though the manor itself was holding its breath. Rain slicked the ivy-covered walls, and the sky, a muted shade of pewter, hung low as if mourning the loss of its master. Lord Reginald Amersham's lifeless form had been removed quietly during the early hours, escorted by 2 grim-faced constables who spoke in hushed tones. The guests, now detainees in a gilded cage, gathered uneasily in the drawing room, sipping tepid tea and casting suspicious glances at one another. Hercule Poirot, pristine and composed as always, sat alone in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, his fingertips pressed together in contemplation. His mind, sharp and orderly, was already mapping the evening's events. The precise time of the toast, the sequence of movements, the subtle shifts in expression when Amersham's body fell back, his glass slipping from his grasp and shattering dramatically across the floor. Such theatrics, such symbolism. But it was not the drama that held Poirot's attention. It was the missing envelope. The toast had been expected to coincide with an important announcement. Several guests had hinted at it the evening prior. A change in inheritance, a confession. Of sorts, a long-held secret perhaps finally ready to be aired. But when the toast came, the envelope was nowhere to be found, and moments later, Amersham was dead. Coincidence? Poirot thought not. Chief Inspector Barnaby of the local constabulary had arrived shortly after dawn. A capable, if unimaginative, man, he had begun questioning the guests in procedural order, unaware that Poirot had already begun his own more precise inquiry. The guests were a varied and complex ensemble, each with motive buried beneath layers of etiquette. Lady Edith Amersham, the widow, dressed now in mourning black, her eyes swollen not with grief, but with something darker, guilt, perhaps, or fear. She had hovered close to her husband before the toast, fussing over his cuffs, whispering something no one could hear. Then there was Rupert Vale, the family solicitor, who had arrived that very morning from London with documents he claimed Amersham had requested, though he offered no proof of this. Rupert was a thin man with watery eyes, and Poirot noted how often those eyes flicked to the writing desk in the corner, where personal letters were usually kept. Celeste Dupont, Amersham's French niece, was another curious presence. Graceful, intelligent, and quietly intense, she had barely reacted to her uncle's collapse. Poirot had observed her fingering a ring on her hand during the toast, an old signet ring belonging to Amersham himself. She claimed it had been a gift, but her explanation was vague, and Poirot had filed that away for further questioning. Then there were the younger guests, Marcus Elwood, a brash business associate of Amersham's, and Beatrice Langley, a rising actress known to have had a past romantic entanglement with the victim. Marcus had been drunk that night, belligerent even, Yet Poirot suspected the man's clumsiness was an intentional mask. Beatrice, by contrast, had withdrawn immediately, vanishing for nearly 20 minutes after the toast, her absence unexplained. Poirot had requested to see the wine bottle used in the toast. It had been opened by the butler, Mr. Kellings, in front of all, and poured evenly into crystal flutes lined up on a silver tray. The butler's hands were steady, his reputation impeccable, and yet Poirot had asked to inspect the cork, the decanter, and the tray itself. There was nothing obvious, no residue, no foreign scent, but that meant little to a man like Poirot. It was not what was present that mattered. It was what was missing. The envelope, yes, but more so, the motivation behind its absence. He had walked the room where the toast occurred, the grand dining hall with its deep oak table, portraits looming on the walls, and a single candelabra casting shadows. There had been 12 guests, 12 glasses, and yet 13 chairs set. Poirot had counted twice. Who had set the extra place? Was it a mistake or a message? Poirot asked Barnaby for access to Ambersham's private study. The inspector reluctantly agreed, and together they stepped inside the dim room. The study smelled of pipe smoke, leather, and secrets. Shelves of books lined the walls, many with folded corners, some still wrapped in cellophane. The desk was a mess of correspondence, open ledgers, and a locked drawer. Poirot examined the drawer's keyhole. It had been tampered with. The lock was traditional brass, easily picked by someone with the skill. Inside, the drawer contained several documents, some of them legal in nature, but one file stood out. It was marked confidential, not to be opened until my toast. Inside, it was empty. The document had been removed, perhaps stolen moments before the toast. Poirot turned to Barnaby with a quiet but firm certainty. Mon ami, someone in this house knew what was in that envelope, and knew it could not be revealed. The inspector looked unconvinced. It could have been anyone. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Precisely, which is why it was someone no one suspects. Poirot returned to the drawing room and called for each guest individually. He asked them nothing about the murder at first. Instead, he inquired about their relationship with Lord Ambersham, what they had expected of the toast, and, most importantly, where they had been in the moments just before the clinking of glasses. Most answers were predictable, rehearsed even, but Marcus Elwood hesitated when asked about a brief absence he took to smoke a cigar on the balcony. "Did anyone see you?" Poirot asked gently. Marcus shook his head. "No, but I was out there. Alone. Just needed air." Poirot noted the smudge on the man's sleeve. Dust from an old ledge, perhaps? Celeste was next, her answers poised, calm. But when Poirot mentioned the envelope, her composure faltered. "There was no envelope," she said quickly. "None that I saw." Poirot inclined his head. "But you expected one." She looked away. Uncle Reginald mentioned it, in passing. Her words betrayed her. Poirot knew the envelope had been anticipated by more than just Celeste. Beatrice, too, had muttered something about Reginald's truth finally being told. The envelope contained something powerful enough to kill over, and its disappearance was no accident. Poirot returned to the study alone that evening and stood before the fireplace. He stared into the dying embers, his mind sifting through details. The broken glass, the 12th toast, the 13th chair, the missing file, the ring on Celeste's hand, and the late-night walk Marcus claimed. One of them had taken the envelope. One of them had tampered with the glass. And yet it was all too convenient, too dramatic. Poirot whispered aloud, "Non, mon ami. This is theater." But the killer, they perform with precision. Just then, a floorboard creaked behind him. Poirot turned. No one was there. Only the long hallway, dim and quiet. But in the silence, something stirred, the certainty that someone had watched him. The killer had not fled. The killer was still within these walls. Chapter 3. The Secrets Beneath the Ashes. The fire crackled weakly in the grand hearth of Charnwood Hall as dawn began to press its dim gray fingers through the stained glass windows, casting fractured light across the drawing room, where Hercule Poirot stood before the embers, eyes narrowed in contemplation. The atmosphere was not one of mourning, it was one of calculation. Something beneath the layers of aristocratic grief was festering, a bitterness so finely veiled by custom that it might have gone unnoticed to any man less obsessive than Poirot. He had spent the hours since Lord Amersham's death moving like a shadow through the house, not questioning openly but watching, recording expressions, noting every hesitation in speech, every glance held too long or not long enough. And it was there, in the quiet aftermath of the toast that had turned into a death sentence, that Poirot began to reconstruct the shape of the truth, not by what was said, but by what was carefully left unsaid. The room still reeked faintly of brandy and smoke, and Poirot's mind, a machine of exquisite precision, replayed the final moments over and over again. Lord Amersham had lifted the glass, paused as though waiting for approval or dread, then drank, and then the silence had fractured into screams, gasps, and a crashing of cutlery. But in that brief pause, Poirot remembered, Amersham had looked directly at Lady Eleanor, not with love nor hatred, but fear. The kind of fear that comes not from an enemy, but a confidant. And Lady Eleanor, still composed even as the paramedics declared her husband dead, had merely nodded once, as if confirming a prophecy she had long accepted. That gesture haunted Poirot, and it became his compass. Now he needed facts, not just instincts. So he asked for the guest list again, and this time demanded to see the original invitations. They were handwritten, personal, and distinctively signed. Yet one stood out. A card addressed to a Mr. Lionel Graves, a name none of the household staff recognized, and whose signature was not in the guest book, though Poirot was certain he had seen an unfamiliar man in a gray suit standing beside the servants' staircase. Just before the toast began, Poirot pressed Inspector Farrow to follow up on the name, and as expected, no records existed of any such person associated with Amersham or Charnwood Hall. An uninvited guest, a ghost in a tailored suit. Why attend? Except to witness or ensure the completion of something dreadful. Yet the more troubling question, to Poirot, was why no one else had noticed him. Was it possible someone had helped him blend in? Or worse, had someone known he would come? As Poirot explored the west wing of the house, he found himself drawn to Amersham's private study, sealed since the death. With Farrow's approval and Lady Eleanor's strained consent, they entered. Dust covered every surface, except one corner of the mahogany desk where a letter had recently rested. A letter, now missing. Poirot bent closer, using his handkerchief to lift a single strand of white ash and a barely noticeable smear of wax, as though a sealed envelope had been hastily burned and snuffed out. The ash was pale and crumbled too easily. It had not been fully incinerated in a fireplace, but burned quickly, perhaps in a waste bin. Someone had panicked. Someone had wanted something erased before Poirot arrived. On the shelf nearby was an old naval logbook, oddly out of place. Inside, Poirot found what he had been expecting, a page removed, violently torn, leaving behind small threads at the binding. This wasn't a logbook anymore. It was a journal, a personal one. And the torn page? Likely the original letter Amersham had intended to read aloud during the toast. Poirot said nothing aloud, but in his eyes, the flame returned. There had been a plan behind this evening. Amersham had known he might die. He had written something meant to outlive him, and someone had ensured that it wouldn't. Who could have accessed this study after the death and before Poirot arrived? Only those who had the confidence to move through the house unnoticed, to claim authority they did not rightfully hold. Poirot thought again of Miss Imogen Vale, the young woman with the trembling hands and antique necklace, an heirloom that, when questioned, she claimed belonged to her mother. And yet, Poirot had seen its twin once before, years ago, on a woman. Tried in Belgium for high treason. There was a lineage here, something buried, something that would only surface through confrontation. And so Poirot set a trap. He requested another gathering, one final toast, this time in memoriam. The guests, though unsettled, agreed. The hall was arranged again, though this time, Poirot stood at the head, with Pharaoh in the shadows and a decanter filled not with brandy, but a harmless substitute. When the glasses were raised, Poirot watched not the drink, but the hands, the hesitations, the darting glances, the position of the eyes. And there it was. Lady Eleanor's fingers barely touched the glass, and her eyes didn't meet the liquid. Instead, they shifted quickly toward Imogen, whose own expression fractured for just a moment too long. Poirot cleared his throat and spoke softly but firmly. Before we drink to the dead, perhaps it is time we speak of the living, of secrets, of guests uninvited, and of letters that do not burn cleanly. The silence that followed was not one of respect, but dread. In that instant, the room knew. The game had shifted. The detective was no longer searching. He was revealing. And nothing, hidden, no matter how carefully buried beneath ashes or guilt, could remain in the dark much longer. Chapter 4. The Garden of Forked Lies. It was nearly 5 o'clock in the evening, and the sun hung low over the twisted hedgerows of Charnwood Hall's vast formal gardens, casting golden ribbons of light across the gravel paths and carefully curated flower beds. But the beauty of the garden, once Lord Amersham's pride, had curdled into something theatrical, a stage set for deceit, secrets, and betrayal. Hercule Poirot stood at the edge of the east parterre, where lavender met creeping time, the scents mingling in an oddly funereal perfume that clung to the chill air. He had asked that no one leave the grounds, and for once, the remaining guests had complied, albeit reluctantly. They had moved like players in an unseen drama, each aware of the invisible eyes tracking their movements, each retreating into themselves, protecting their alibis like delicate glass. And Poirot, always watching, was quietly gathering the final strands of truth. For it was here, in this place of order and cultivation, that the most chaotic truths were beginning to take shape. The ashes from the fireplace in Amersham's study had revealed partially burned documents. Memos from a solicitor named Harold Blythe, which referenced amendments to a trust that had not yet been officially filed. Poirot had retrieved them himself, using silver tongs from the mantel. Carefully pieced together, they suggested that Lord Amersham had been on the brink of disinheriting not just his son Quentin, but also his brother Charles, a former diplomat whose name had long been tangled with financial mismanagement and quiet political disgrace. The new beneficiary? The household secretary, Miss Edith Faulkner. It was a detail that landed like a bombshell, even in Poirot's own mind. Miss Faulkner, whose gray skirts and quiet manners had made her nearly invisible to the casual eye, was now suddenly central to everything. But Poirot, master of nuance, knew better than to assume guilt based on motive alone. Yes, oh, it was in the garden, beneath a sky rapidly bruising into dusk, that Poirot chose to confront Miss Faulkner, not with accusation, but with the soft, incisive logic that always preceded the cracking of a case. She had been tending to the old rose arbor, pruning the dry canes with gloved hands, when he approached. "Mademoiselle Faulkner," he said gently, "I believe we are both tired of shadows. Perhaps it is time for clarity." She looked up, startled, but there was no panic, only a steady weariness in her eyes, as if she'd been expecting this moment all day. They walked slowly among the winding paths, and she spoke in careful tones, confessing what she knew but stopping short of what she feared. She had discovered the change in the will only days before the party, she said. Lord Amersham had given her instructions to prepare his final documents for the toast, but the envelope had gone missing from her writing desk the day before the gathering. She had told no one, not even Ambersham himself, out of fear that it would reflect incompetence. Poirot listened without interrupting, but when she finished, he offered a single question. Were you aware that Lord Ambersham intended to name you sole heir? Miss Faulkner hesitated only slightly, and then said yes, and that she had never wanted the inheritance, only his approval. Her voice broke briefly, then recomposed itself like a veil falling back into place. It was a compelling confession, but not a confession of guilt. Poirot knew she was hiding something, but not the murder. Someone else had known about the envelope, and someone had gone through extraordinary lengths to remove it before it could be read aloud. Elsewhere in the house, Inspector Japp had discovered something far more tangible, a fresh set of muddy footprints leading from the back terrace through the conservatory and out to the garden's eastern wall, where the hedges concealed a narrow service gate. The prints belonged to Charles Ambersham. He had denied being outside during the rain that night, citing a headache and a preference for the fireplace. But the soles matched an expensive pair of Italian loafers found in his bedroom, still damp with mud. When questioned, Charles had scoffed at the idea of murder. Reginald's heart was as fragile as his pride, he had said. Any doctor could have told you that. The man drank brandy like it was water. I would have needed only time, not poison. A curious deflection, Poirot thought, and far too rehearsed. Back in the garden, Poirot found his thoughts drifting back to the missing envelope. If the killer had taken it, why not destroy it completely? Why burn only part of the evidence? Unless they wanted to burn something else entirely and only stumbled upon the envelope later. He recalled Edith Faulkner's writing desk, meticulously organized, save for one detail. A faint wax imprint on the inside of a drawer, shaped like a rose seal. The seal Ambersham used only for personal letters. Poirot returned to the study. That night, lit a candle, and held it gently beneath the drawer's underside. There, barely visible in the flickering light, was a thin layer of soot and a scent that did not belong, jasmine ink. Not the ink Faulkner used, but the brand favored by Quentin, Lord Ambersham's son. The pieces were tilting into alignment. Now, Quentin had motive, disinheritance. He had opportunity, a free run of the house. And he had the temperament, moody, unpredictable, bristling with quiet resentment. But Poirot wasn't ready to point the finger just yet. There remained the matter of the toast. Lord Ambersham had insisted on a very specific brand of champagne, one imported directly from a vineyard in Alsace, a brand he referred to as poetry. In a bottle. Only one bottle had been opened that night. Only one glass had been poured. And only one man had died. Poirot requested the bottle be retrieved from the cellar and personally inspected it. The cork, still intact on the floor near the fireplace, bore no markings, but the foil wrapping around the bottle had a minute slit near the lip, an incision made, perhaps, by a hypodermic needle. The poison had not been added afterward. It had been injected beforehand, allowed to mix slowly with the champagne before it was ever opened. A patient plan, a chilling plan, and one that pointed to someone with access to the bottle well before the evening's events. When Poirot returned to the garden the following morning, frost had formed along the hedges. Charles Ambersham was pacing near the marble fountain, cigarette trembling slightly in his fingers. Poirot approached, eyes locked on the older man's as he said, "Your brother did not trust you, monsieur. But he did not fear you. He underestimated your desperation." Charles exhaled sharply, a plume of smoke rising between them. "Are you accusing me, Poirot?" Poirot tilted his head slightly. "I accuse no one. Not yet. But I ask, why inject the champagne when it was so much easier? To tamper with the glass? Unless, of course, you were not certain which glass he would choose." Charles said nothing, but his silence said enough. Poirot walked away slowly, letting the wind carry the scent of roses and ash behind him. The garden had offered its truth, in fragments, buried beneath layers of civility and grooming. But now the forked path lay ahead, one leading toward justice, and the other toward final revelation. All that remained was to choose the right one. And Hercule Poirot, the man who never guessed, had already chosen. Chapter 5. The Quietest Scream. The truth, when it finally emerged, did so not with a bang or a grand confession, but as a whisper in the silence, a quiet scream muffled by years of secrets, buried deep beneath the civility and opulence of Charnwood Hall. Poirot stood by the window of the drawing room, staring out at the gray dawn breaking through a sky still heavy with the remnants of storm. The house had gone still, eerily so, as if it too were waiting for the weight of the truth to settle into its bones. The guests, what remained of them, sat in various corners of the house, their masks having long since slipped away. Lady Evelyn was pacing the corridor with the nervous energy of a widow who had never expected to be one. Inspector Garrow had grown quiet, deferential even, in the presence of the one man who had stitched together threads no one else could see. And Poirot, with his gloved hands neatly folded before him, prepared to deliver what he knew would be the final, irrefutable unraveling. The missing envelope, the one meant to accompany the final toast, had not been stolen after Ambersham's collapse, as everyone assumed. No, it had never made it into the room, because Reginald had never intended for its contents to be read aloud at all. Poirot had found it tucked away inside a hollowed copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses in the study, the book itself chosen not for symbolism but convenience. Inside it, the contents, a confession. Reginald's own handwriting revealed a past crime, one long buried beneath decades of silence, a scandal not of infidelity or fortune, but of blood. 32 years ago, Reginald's brother Arthur, thought to have died in a fire in the West Wing, had not perished in an accident. He had been killed, not by fire, not by mischance, but by Reginald himself. They had argued over inheritance, over legitimacy, and in a moment of fury, Arthur had been struck and left unconscious in the West Wing library. The fire had been set to cover it all, and no one had questioned it. But guilt, like time, has teeth. Reginald had spent the final years of his life burdened by it, and with no heir, no son to leave his title or estate to, he had begun to unravel under the weight of what he had done. The final toast, Poirot realized, was never meant as a celebration. It was a death knell, a theatrical curtain call from a man too cowardly to confess in life, too tormented to find peace in silence. But why had he died that night? If he had planned a confession, why poison the glass? And then Poirot had seen it, the most telling detail of all. The wine glass that had held the poisoned drink was not the one poured by Reginald himself. It had been switched, deliberately. The poison, it turned out, was not Reginald's choice but someone else's. Someone had found the envelope before Poirot did. Someone who knew what the toast was meant to reveal and decided to ensure it never would. And thus, the question was no longer why Reginald died, but who had the most to lose if he lived long enough to speak. The suspects remained, but Poirot's focus narrowed, his instincts leading him not to Lady Evelyn, not to Rupert the resentful cousin, nor even to James Forsyth who stood to gain control of the Ambersham Trust. No, Poirot turned his gaze to the one person who had remained consistently invisible, the housekeeper, Miss Eliza Vane. She had been with the family for nearly 40 years, a fixture of the estate, forgotten in the room, yet privy to every whispered secret, every door left ajar. Poirot confronted her not with accusations, but with silence. And in that silence, Eliza folded like old parchment. She had been Arthur's lover. Secretly, silently. A love forbidden by class, denied by Reginald, and destroyed by the fire that had taken Arthur's life and nearly hers as well. She had survived, but carried the burn on her left hand as a daily reminder. Reginald's death, she confessed in tears, was not about revenge, it was about justice. She could not bear the thought of him dying peacefully, remembered as a dignified patriarch. She had stolen the envelope before dinner, read the confession meant to absolve his soul, and made her decision. The poison, aconitine, slow and painful, had been prepared long ago, kept in a place of sentiment, a locket that once belonged to Arthur. Eliza switched the glasses while serving the wine, and by the time Reginald stood to speak, it was already working its way into his blood. And thus, when he raised his glass to deliver his truth, death spoke first. Poirot listened, as he always did, not judging, not forgiving, only understanding. Eliza was taken quietly by Garrow and his men. There was no spectacle, no final gasp of guilt or rage, only silence. And so, the final scream at Charnwood Hall had not been one of sound, but of silence. A scream buried in decades of shame, love, grief, and fire. Poirot remained at the estate until noon, his thoughts unspoken, his expression unreadable. When he finally left, it was with a subtle nod to the staff, and the echo of one phrase whispered beneath his breath. Even the quietest scream leaves a mark. And so ends the mystery of the final toast, a tale not of murder alone, but of memory and the voices we silence until they burn their way free. If you enjoyed this story and would love to dive deeper into more masterfully crafted Poirot mysteries brought to life with rich storytelling and careful detail, don't forget to subscribe, like, and explore the rest of the mysteries awaiting you. Your next case is just one click away.